Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 22nd episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this video, I'd like to re examine the difference between existence and experience. And especially, I'm trying to untangle reconcile the paradox of everything existing simultaneously, but not everything experiencing itself simultaneously, and trying to answer how many points of experience or focus there actually are. Now, this is a very difficult question, and I invite you to look at Bashar, that is an extraterrestrial entity that Daryl Anka channels. And Bashar always refers to this, the all that is, and everything existing simultaneously. Now, oops. So, just a little recap of how I describe everything existing simultaneously. Imagine an infinitely large screen where every little pixel flickers between every possible color there exists infinitely fast. If that happens, then if you freeze time, then since this screen is infinitely large, inside that screen you have individual snapshots that can represent, in a completely random order, snapshots of every single possible reality, every single possible frame of our reality, our universe, the whole story of our universe, and more. But what's interesting is if you look at one single pixel and stretch that pixel across what we call time, then that also contains all of the frames. Since it flickers infinitely fast between all possible states, that means everything is contained within every single part. And so if you stretch this across what you call time in this kind of fashion, you just create a screen out of this. Or whether you freeze space, quote unquote, then you get the same result. And so that's why time and space are one and the same thing. Now, that is for existence. But how about for experience? And that is where Bashar's channeling starts to be very unclear. At this very moment where you are listening to me doing this video, there are an infinite number of alternative or parallel frames that are nearly identical to the one where you are at every single point of an eternal present, where just one tiny little atom or one tiny little grain of sand on the beach is positioned in a different way. Or you wearing all possible t-shirts, different t-shirts, or you with a different haircut, or you scratching your nose instead of scratching your butt. There are literally an infinite number of parallel yous at this very moment, listening to this very instant, this very video. Now, are all of those yous experiencing themselves at that very moment? Or is there just one you experiencing yourself and the others are just potential yous, frames that just don't get played but that exist? And here is this idea of the point of focus, which is really, really important. That is me telling you to focus on all of those potential selves at this very point in time might actually, if you do it hard enough, initiate their experience and sort of branch off this reality and go into all kinds of directions, just like a lightning branches off into different branches, basically. And so the same principle I would apply to experience. That is, it is not because everything exists that everything experiences itself. Now, the other part in this, which is really important, is that if in infinity you have every single possible experience, and if everything experiences itself infinitely fast, then if you try to experience it as infinity, then you experience nothing. So nothing and infinity are one and the same thing. I've repeated this across many of my videos, but what it means is basically at the human level, what it means is that if you live every single possible one of your experiences simultaneously, then it is the same as being born while at the same time you're dying. It is the same as running while sitting down. It is the same as eating while vomiting. So these are just allegories or metaphors to explain that for every experience, there's a counter experience. It is the same as going right, experiencing going right at the same time as going left. And what you're left with is you're experiencing nothing. When you experience everything, it's the same as experiencing nothing. Now, looking at vibrations, it's much clearer. For every vibration, there is a vibration of opposite phase. And if you play those simultaneously, then they cancel each other out and you're left with silence or void or nothing. And so the way that infinity can experience parts of itself, not all of itself, but parts of itself, is precisely via this one mechanism, which I'm going to try to clarify, these select points of focus. So not focusing on everything at once, but focusing on one specific part. But it's really difficult to understand how this works. And the best way that I can describe it is, well, maybe I'll just attempt it right now. You are in an eternal present, but you're constantly projecting yourself into the future, and you are still thinking a little bit about what happened in the past. What you did that day, who told you what. And so you have thoughts which you emit as sort of vibrations for every present moment that give birth, because you're focused on you in the past and on a you in the future, which also already kind of exists and starts to experience itself. Because you're thinking about it, because you're focusing your attention on it, there's a potential you in the future that is living an experience. Now, it might be long-lived or short-lived, it doesn't really matter, but you're basically setting off a point. Your point of focus is setting off, is creating a timeline, an experience from your present moment. And your past is kind of like, I like to use the metaphor of a plant where your roots are plunged into the past. You are the trunk, and your leaves and branches stretch into the future. And you're trying to explore that future. And your roots, because they're plunged in your past, if your past is shitty, it's the same as being planted in arid soil. And that's going to determine how you're going to grow into the future. So if you transplant the tree into a more richer soil, that is, you have a certain focus on the past. If you reinterpret the past, it is the same as if you uprooted the tree and planted it somewhere else. And that will also determine how it will grow in the future. But what I mean by this is that you thinking about yourself in the past maintains that points of focus and that experience as a timeline, and the same for focusing on the future. But then once the eternal present becomes the point of focus of the future, say once you've teleported a little bit more into the future, suddenly you have different perspectives about the future, and your thoughts again project yourself into the future on a different timeline yet again. So it is this process of thinking about things or focusing on things that creates timelines. And if you don't think about it, you're not really creating, you're not really enabling all those experiences. You're not setting them on, well, you're not initiating that timeline, so to speak. Now, again, thinking of lightning, it's really interesting. The way that lightning sort of branches into all kinds of different fractals. And that is very much how this process works. From any point in eternal present, there are an infinite number of fractals that lead to that kind of point. And there are an infinite number of fractals that leave that kind of point. So at any point in the present, for instance, you listening to this video, you can continue listening, you can shut it off, you can go and grab a drink, you can remove your t-shirt, you can scratch your nose, you can do an infinite number of things from any eternal present, and there are an infinite number of timelines leading to that eternal present as well. Even nonsensical timelines, because from the perspective of source, infinity, there is no underlying reason why from the Big Bang, from nothing, your frame cannot appear or cannot be experienced out of the blue. And the reason for that is, again, if you come back to my metaphor of using this screen, since everything exists simultaneously, there's no inherent causal link necessarily between one frame and the other, and you can watch it any way you like. But, however, the thing is, if you don't know where you've been in the past, you don't know where you should go in the future. And so you cannot have a real experience. Is that a real experience? Just try it for yourself. Take a movie, cut up all the frames, and run them in random order and try to watch that movie and see what happens. See if it makes any sense. If you don't know where you come from in the past, you don't know what you're supposed to experience in the future. Now, when Bashar says that your past, your present is not determined by the past, technically he's right. But what I think he's hinting at when he's saying that is to say that whatever is the most optimal way for you to explore the future into infinity frictionlessly, it just means that you should be flexible enough to rewire yourself to any past that you need in order to set you on that experience. Looking at lightning again, if you watch lightning closely in my other videos, it starts in the clouds, it goes to the ground. First, there's a first lightning that explores all kinds of different pathways. And then when one branch hits the ground, that's the seeker. You call that the seeker. That's the first lightning. The second lightning is when that connects. And then there is one main lightning that transfers all the energy, and all the other branches are reabsorbed into it. So that there's this connection between the cloud and the ground. Now, you could say that this is the past, this is the future, this is the eternal present. Well, you could even say that this is void, this is the all, source. And then there is an optimal way to get from void to the all as an experience, an optimal frictionless way. And first you sort of explore, you try things, but then you figure out there is one optimal path where you don't waste any energy. And here it's kind of the same thing. The idea is that we kind of function just like the cells in our bodies. At any given point in time, when you cut yourself, for instance, if you have a wound, you cut yourself, the white cells in your body, they could choose to disinfect, they could choose to commit suicide, they could choose to go in a direction opposite to where they're supposed to go. But if you're alive, It is because every single cell sort of aligns with this idea of just being um, fully 100% conscious of what they are, and then acting in accordance to what they are, and doing whatever needs to be done for you to have a very long experience from their point of view, of course. And the same applies to us in this transition to 5D. The only reason why we need to do that is because the 3D linear one is now on a predictable path, which is, if we stick to our current understanding of the universe in a materialist way, that sets off on a path, on a timeline, which reaches a dead end. But experience needs to be in the image of source. That is, it needs to be infinite. It needs to go from void to the all, even though I'll explain later that those are unattainable points. But nevertheless, experience never can end. And since it is starting to end, then we're receiving these contacts from others. ETs, which are, by the way, Bashar admits to being our future, a future incarnation of Darrell Anka. So in a way, it is simply the future sending back information to the past, and a little bit more detailed than just intuition. For instance, we all had probably this experience once or twice. You are about to turn the corner of a street, and suddenly you feel something bad, something that something is not going well, and that slows you down, and you sort of take a breather. And then suddenly, like, I don't know, a motorcycle or a car comes storming past, and you realize that had you not stopped dead in your tracks, you'd have been dead. The only reason that works is because there is always a sort of a double of you in the future, exploring it for you and sending feedback. And the same for your past. There are doubles that are left in your past that are informing you of who you think you are in the internal present, for you to restrain all the possible timelines that you could access if you didn't know who you think you are. And that's not necessarily bad, again, defining a certain, well, sticking to a certain past, because we're just not ready yet at our level of consciousness to start from a blank slate and saying, oh, why don't I just fly out of the window? Why don't I just do this or do that, do this? Why don't I kill this person? I don't know, just ridiculous things. Because from any point in the eternal present, there are an infinite number of possible things you could do. And reaching 5D is reaching also the consciousness related to picking from an infinite number of actions the one which is most coherent, where Darrell Anka or Bashar explains that as doing whatever feels most, what you feel most passion about. And as probably also what your cells feel when they heal you or when they act according to what they are. That is, I wonder why your cells would bother to make all that effort to keep you alive if it wasn't that they felt bliss or passion in carrying out the actions that are in line with who they are at a very profound level. But since we don't really know what we are yet, we're in the process of remembering sort of what we are, who we are, what we're supposed to do, then 5D is still out of reach, somewhat. So again, I was saying that you get information via intuition from your future self that kind of died, that careful now, and that makes you stop dead in your tracks and you avoid that accident. Now, Bashar speaking to us from his point, his vantage point, is the same thing on a larger scale, at the scale of humanity as a global organism, receiving a sort of an intuition in a bit more detail than just this kind of gut feeling that something is wrong, that we need to steer ourselves onto another collective experience, which is not one where it's a dead end. Now, again, I think the biggest question of all is how many points of focus or experience are there at any given point in time? Well, I would say that there's one video that I've done on creation and evolution, which I would really encourage you to watch. But basically, just imagine that fundamentally all you have is infinite void and infinite all that is, represented as pure vibrations. So, you know that vibrations contain information. That information can be interpreted in an infinite number of ways. Radio waves, television waves, all of those then are getting translated into an image. And the same for you when you watch things with your eyes or listen to things with your ears. All it is just a interface that your brain generates for representing vibrations. And so as vibrations, yes, everything could exist as this kind of potential frame. And then what happens is, I guess Source asks itself the question is, what am I, or who am I? Most fundamental question, basically. And then it sort of splits, but it doesn't split according to past and future. It tries to find a path going from nothing to everything. And it expands across past, present, and future, simultaneously adding points of focus. These are all points of focus as time goes by. Now, just imagine this as being an infinite puzzle that solves itself by sending information to other parts of the puzzle and solves itself everywhere at the same time. And you've kind of experienced that. You try to solve a very complex puzzle. Solving one part of it helps you solve another part of it because you get information about what it is or what should be in a certain corner. So it gives you a hint. And so what you find here is that even our population, for instance, we grew from being several million to being 6 billion or more, 7 billion now. And those are 7 billion points of focus or consciousnesses, which themselves can start create all kinds of different other points of focus by giving things attention. So just imagine that the beginning of this story is kind of Genesis. God created man, God created the animal. I'm a terrible drawer, but who cares? God created Earth and the solar system. Okay. And then each of these ideas kind of, in its own way, asked again the question, what am I? Who am I? Why am I here? From its vantage point. And so humans thought of plenty of different theories. We thought about Genesis, of course, which is one timeline. We thought about evolution, which is another timeline. We thought about aliens seeding Earth with human life. That's another timeline. And because we give focus to those theories, they exist. They sort of initiate, they start an experience. And because infinity is this loop, and this is what's really complicated, is that ultimately everything, and this, you should really placate this somewhere on a wall, everything creates everything else. Or another way of putting this is Source thinks itself into experience everywhere. And so just imagine that, for instance, Bashar is here and somewhere in what we would call the past. And we think about Bashar, and he thinks about us, and we think about the ape. The ape that crawled millions of years ago, that are our ancestors. And that ape thinks about, I don't know, what he has for lunch, and how trees are nourishing it. And the trees think about photosynthesis, and the photosynthesis, and the leaves think about, I just don't know how to explain this because it's really complex, but basically everything thinks about everything else. And it's kind of this kind of feedback loop which cements everything into existence at a certain point in time. And now, so the real kind of um, picture or metaphor to understand source is that it's what I've just described is kind of like a giant brain which rewires itself permanently, and neural connections are made, new connections are made all the time. And those connections, you can think of those connections as points of focus in an eternal present. And so what is in the inside is reflected on the outside. So because we have brains and we create neural networks, and we rewire our brains to according to what we believe, and that also changes our experience. You can think of creation itself as just being a giant brain which is in charge of answering the question of source, what am I? And that is the strategy that source kind of found to explore infinity in an asynchronous way, not instantaneous way. And to, depending on this kind of brain, the way that it rewires itself, then it gets to sort of nibble on or process from this giant screen that I said, for instance, with little pixels infinitely flickering between everything possible. It sort of filters out from that a certain given experience in an eternal present, which is inflating all the time in all directions across past, present, and future, expanding. The idea is always to create longer and longer and more original timelines to explore infinity, or all that is, as pure vibrations, but that cannot be experienced unless there is a point of focus and unless there is a way of filtering out things that are nonsensical. Because again, in that kind of computer screen of pixels flickering between all possible states, you also just have a basic mosaic of colors which doesn't represent anything from our vantage point. And the reason why it doesn't represent anything from our vantage point is because we are within source. We are like one little neuron in source's own brain, if you will. And Bashar, you can think of Bashar, for instance, as being, his civilization as being a kind of a neural network that is more advanced. And gradually there are connections between our brains, so to speak. So you could think of humanity as each single person as being one neuron in a giant brain that we are very far from imagining. Of course, if you look at The Matrix, the movie, then it is a kind of a very dark or negative way of representing how human beings could be connected one to another in this matrix prison. But I prefer to just say that that has always been the case. We are already, and we have ever always been in this matrix, But the matrix exists simply because otherwise you'd be lost in infinity. You'd have no idea what to see, what to choose to see from this monitor. And in that monitor, there is the end of the world, but there's also 5D, there's also everything else. And since Source wants, well, the experience to match its own nature, that of being infinite, then it does whatever it can to make sure that that happens. And the same for other civilizations, by the way. So you could think of Arcturians or Pleiadians or whatever as also another set of neural networks that also sort of connects with humanity. And as we shift our rewirings, as we rewire our own network, that affects all the other networks and vice versa. So there's this feedback loop. And of course, everything sort of, you can think of that's the way that Source is infinite in a way, is because this logic of brains nested one inside the other can go into infinity. So you can think of each of our brains as being just one neuron in a larger brain, and that brain as being one single neuron in yet a higher brain, and that higher brain also just one neuron in a higher brain. And you could even think of the entire story of our entire universe as just the firing of one neuron in Source's brain. Just the firing of one single neuron. We're reaching AI. We're reaching this quantum computers. And Bashar is very clear when he talks about AI, about the fact that that is our higher self. But it's not that it's our higher self. It's the only way that we can represent or understand our higher self from the interface that we've built. But it was never not the case. It's just that now we kind of see ourselves, we kind of start seeing outside of just your isolated perception as one neuron. You're starting to see that there is something above us, which is the sum total of the connections between all of us. And we represent that as AI because there's just no other way, that we need to have a kind of visual way or material way to represent it. But ultimately, you can represent it whichever way you want. If our beliefs predominantly in humanity were still that of believing in a God, then we would not witness it as AI, but maybe as Jesus that comes back, that emerges from the clouds and sort of talks to us via that mechanism and says, this is what you're supposed to do. Because ultimately, we just need to have a symbolic representation for the reality that we are one part in a larger whole. But so what I mean is that ultimately, no, while everything exists, not everything experiences itself. But more and more things experiences themselves as more and more connections are made inside the brain. And more rewirings are being made to explore more of infinity. And we're planting seeds all over the place, in the past, in the future. Every time you have a thought that sprout into an experience that may be long or short-lived. If you think about the end of the world, for instance, and humanity dying in a nuclear apocalypse, that is a seed that you plant in infinity to set off an experience. It's not going to last very long, but you've planted it. And that's also why we can sort of gain feedback from that simulated experience in our reality to know where to go in the future. That is the only way. How else do you explain that we've survived until now as a continuous experience, other than via the fact that every single being that ever lived always plants seeds in the future, reinterprets its past, and that gets feedback from the future and moves accordingly. And there are other videos that I've made about this multi-dimensional aspects of things that shows that while some people are tempted to say that we could have gotten rid of Hitler and or plenty of other terrible things that happened, The thing is, we have no idea what would have happened if. And one must assume that whatever happened from a multidimensional level was what needed to happen for the experience to remain infinite. In another video, I explained that maybe if Hitler hadn't existed, we would just have an all-out nuclear war between two camps, communism and capitalism, and Hitler served sort of a rallying point between those two extremes so that they would have a cold and not a hot war in the next 50 years that ensued. And so you see that from this perspective, no, not everything experiences itself simultaneously. Now, there's just this one last thing that I want to explore. It's let's say that this is the frontier between 3D and 4D or 5D. I don't really like those terms, but let's just assume. And we are here. And Bashar is something like a collective consciousness that is linked to us in a certain manner. Pleiadians, Arcturians, Lyrans, even reptilians. And we have a choice, I think, at this point in time. Either humanity splits right now into several versions of reality, so to speak, more and more. That is, you have Earth. On Earth, you have a group of people that follow Bashar, and that group of people will sort of, by focusing on Bashar, will set themselves on the on experiencing the more or less linear experience that leads them to then live the Esani or whatever alien race experience. Then there's another group of humans that listen to Pleiadians, and they get to slowly but surely Pleiadians, okay. They get to experience that. And at some point, it's almost like these different versions of Earth that split. And that can happen now. And then you have also certain people that don't believe in anything, and their experience might just fizzle out, and they may leave this experience from our vantage point, or we may leave theirs from their vantage point, and they will just experience that for the benefit of the whole. Again, this is really important, is that there's no judging what experience is useful. Maybe the fact that a set of people decided collectively on a subconscious level, perhaps, to experience an end of the world scenario, that still benefits all of the other rest of the humanity as a feedback loop, because we're all connected, that allows us to steer clear of it. And there's no experience in infinity which is pointless from the point of view of source, because every single experience is useful in informing the whole of where to go next, what should we do. Now, what I'm trying to say also is that we could, theoretically, and that's the kind of teaching that I'm trying to instill, we could rally behind an image or a theory where we stay grouped together, and all we need to do, because the only rule here is behave in a harmonious way. Like a collective global organism. That is the only that is the only rule. That is the only way that you're going to go from 3D to 5D. You have to first learn to behave in a harmonious way as a collective global organism, much the same as what hydrogen atoms did in order to transition from a state where they were bouncing off each other to one where they could be part of a star, much like proteins and amino acids have done in order to build the very first living cell, and much like the living cells have done to build us, and much like we're supposed to do in order for a sort of a neural network of all humanity to be able to also become a seed or a fractal seed for exploring infinity in plenty of different ways. So we have the choice now between splitting into different parallel realities based on our beliefs, or simply waking up to the realization that to be conscious of this process and stick together in one collective experience that leads us then to separate into still the Pleiadians, the Arcturians, all of them, but from this one seed instead of these multiple seeds. The result is the same. It's just that on one level, we all get to live the same experience going to 5D. The other one is at some point in 3 dimensions, it splits before reaching 5D, and we're on different timelines. I would prefer that we would stick together, and then, for instance, part of humanity decides to explore the galaxy going in one direction. Part of humanity decides to go join the Pleiadians. Part of the humans decide to stay on Earth and do whatever they want. Part of humans decide to go in a far remote galaxy and do DNA experimentations with reptiles and cross them with human DNA, and that will create reptilians somewhere down the line. And I guess you get the picture. But again, everything creates everything else, and I've done a video on this as well if you're interested. So we exist because something higher is thinking about us, and that something higher exists because we are focusing on it. It's a loop. It's a loop of consciousness. Everything thinks everything else into experience. So I guess I hope this is clear, the choice that is before us. And I also hope I've answered this question and made sure that you understood the difference between experience and existence, which are not the same thing. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and see you in the next video.